So I'm out here walking near the edge of some swamp, trying to learn some new ground. Basically, I'm scouting in season, carrying a bow with me just in case. I'm trying to learn this area. And I just jumped a really big buck. A definite shooter, no doubt about it. And had I not been lazy, I would have cut across the top of that hillock and perhaps had a chance to at least see him before he saw me. Because I knew I should have done that. I just knew it. There's not a lot of terrain here, so whenever you have something like that, usually the deer will key off of that, especially when you've got good underbrush like this. This past hunting season, the fall was unseasonably warm. In fact, right up until about October 20th, and even a couple of days after that, the weather seemed almost too warm to go into my very best big buck spots. And so I was exploring this new property, working my way along a swamp edge that met up against some hardwoods. And I was trying to scout it, but because it was hunting season, I had my bow with me. And of course, I was going to try to take advantage of any situation in which I encountered either a buck or a doe. I did notice when I was looking at the map on my phone in the parking lot that there was a spot where, uncharacteristically for most of the properties that I hunt, there's actually a little bit of a rise just off of the swamp edge, what I referred to as a little hillock, this location that's about only 70 feet higher in elevation than the swamp itself. And you can call it whatever you want, but I actually had a distinct feeling that that was the premier spot, at least as it related to the dry land locations. All along this edge, you find lots and lots of ladder stands and hang-on stands that have been left there by other hunters. And yes, this is very much a public piece of property, so lots and lots of pressure. I'm encountering a lot of scrapes as I'm going along, lots and lots of rubs. And October 20th is kind of a magical date in my mind, at least where I hunt, because that is, in many ways, the first day that I consistently start seeing mature bucks moving during daylight. So I'm walking up through, and I'm stopping, I'm going out into some of the points that jut out into the swamp, exploring, marking things down on my phone for future hunts on my hunting app, and I get to this location where the hillock is. You can see it on the map. There's kind of a bench just off the western portion of this hillock. And then the swamp itself, which is almost all water in this area, but there are beaver dams and there's some places where you can actually go out into the swamp itself. That's to the west of the gold-colored line. There's a trivial stream, that's the blue-colored ribbon that flows south to north. And as I work my way up to this spot, I'm tired. I've put on a lot of miles on this day on two different properties. And I'm also getting a little distracted by the swamp itself. I want to go out and explore that. You know what it's like. It's almost this intangible feeling like you're drawn to the swamp. You want to go to the swamp. You want to see what's going on there. And I had my harness in my backpack along with a couple of steps and knew that I could climb up one of the conifer trees right on that hard edge between the swamp and the dry ground and just use the rest of that afternoon as a surveillance stand to be able to look and see if there's any deer movement out in the swamp itself. I'd stopped about 300 yards before this location to the south, looked at the map, and determined that I was going to navigate this specific point by going to the east of the hillock. That's the yellow dots. But because I was drawn to the swamp, I made a mistake, and I entered this area via the location marked by the white dots. That red X is where the buck was bedding. Now, I'm guessing that a lot of you would expect a big buck in this scenario to be bedded on the northern facing slope of this hillock. And while that's probably true if this was a mountainous or heavily forested area, because it's a swamp, I've noticed something that seems to take place regularly. Because the wind is largely unobstructed as it crosses a flatland like a swamp, when it encounters a hillock, especially when the wind is running parallel to it, and it was that day, this interesting effect takes place. In the future, I have got a series coming out on wind and thermals. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but suffice it to say that when wind encounters a stationary object, it has to speed up to go around it. In this case, it's going to go to the left and right, but also some of the air particles are going to go right up over the top of it. What ends up ultimately happening is these air particles get bumped out to the left and right, further and further, the farther along this hillock you go. And so this creates a pooling effect, a swirling effect of the air and then the scent that deer are always smelling for. And so when you look at that red X, the location of where that big buck was bedded, he is in a perfect spot on a southwest wind to get lots and lots of intel on anything that might be approaching him, except probably to the north. And the north is the direction in which he's looking. He's looking northeast. I'm trying to learn this area. And I just jumped a really big buck. A definite shooter, no doubt about it. Couldn't tell exactly if it was an 8 or a 10 point, but wide racked, big body. An area of ferns, this point kind of comes down. And we're probably 100 yards back off of the swamp. I'm going to go over and see if I can't find his exact bed, because that'd be helpful in trying to put together why he's there. Drop some milkweed there. My guess is there's something weird going on with the thermals that makes it hard to hunt and makes it really good for him to know that something's coming in. I did get within probably 75 yards of him though. Fortunately, it takes me about 5 seconds for my camera to turn on. I didn't have it on at the time, and he ran up onto the ridge here before I got the camera started. So the wind's coming from that direction. You got this little hillock here. And then he was somewhere right in there in the thick of those ferns. And the swamp itself, you can probably see the light areas down through there. Alright, in a second I'm going to show you this bed. But you might be asking, why in the world would I go in to this bed? Normally I wouldn't, but my wind was blowing directly to him. So I figure the gig's up. Not just for today, but probably for a couple of days. So I'm gonna, even though I know there's a big buck in here, I'm going to want to let this area rest. But always figure there's something to learn. And if I can get in there without causing a whole lot more damage, I'm going to use it as a lesson to figure out why he's bedding here. When in doubt, ask yourself the question, why? When you start asking that question consistently, you start coming up with answers. Then you start to be able to predict where deer will be. Of course, as soon as the first snow hits, these ferns will be knocked down. There'll be nothing bedding in here. Blackberry is all browsed back. All the blackberry is all browsed back. Right there's his bed. And that gives you a little bit of an idea how big. Right here you've got a hawthorn tree. It has some hawthorn fruits on there yet. It's definitely been browsed pretty heavily. Another hawthorn right here. This is probably pretty key, the fact that there's a below down here, a bunch of logs piled up. Gives some structure. Makes him feel like nothing can sneak up on him instantaneously. And then that's the hillock back behind there. Okay, so here's the bed I just showed you. And then I took about 2 more steps, and just on the other side of the log here is another bed. And that bed makes way more sense for today than the other one does. That I'm just about convinced is the bed he would have been in. That makes sense too, kind of looking back where I saw him from. The wind's kind of heading directly this way from that spot right there down into his bed. And you see it's slightly turned. It's kind of, he'd be facing that direction. That's perfect because this hillock actually pumps the wind out just a little bit. All right, let's toss some milkweed and see what happens. I don't know if you could see that or not, but it's definitely swirling in here big time. And the wind today is about as steady as a wind is in this part of the state. So with a lot of water around him and this hillock, it seems to be pulling the thermals so that it's almost always to his advantage. While I was standing here evaluating this bed, I noticed this. Probably about 35, 40 yards from his bed. Unless he just happens not to cross in that spot, somebody else probably knows he's around here too. Now just in there, right between those 2 horizontal logs, that's the first bed. And the second bed is just below the big horizontal log in the middle of the screen. So we're talking 12 yards or so away is a rub here. Now I can't tell you that that's the rub of the buck that I just jumped, but one indication that it's probably a somewhat decent sized antlered buck is that you've got rub here and over here. You can see gouges on this other tree. I know a lot of times people think big rub, big tree, big buck. But I've seen little bucks rub big trees. I've seen big bucks rub little trees. One thing I do find pretty consistent is if you have a high rub, you know, waist high or above, that's going to be made by a big buck because a little buck just can't reach that far with that kind of power. And then as I'm talking, I just noticed this one too over here. Another rub. Again, not a rub that you ooh and ah over. But it's who makes the rub, not what the rub looks like. Wish I would have thrown a trail camera in to get some surveillance on this area. But I didn't. Again, those blowdowns are where the buck bed is, and I just noticed this. Not far from that trail camera is a stand. So I'm going to get out of here because I don't want to mess with somebody else's spot. It's part of public land. I run into people all the time, but I believe the right thing to do as a sportsman when you see somebody else's stuff is to just give them a little bit of space. Until next time, I'm Daryl Meyer with Seeds to Dreams Deer, and I hope that you find more than you think you're hunting for.